Before we start, quick disclaimer. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not financial, investment, tax, or legal advice. Everyone's income, expenses, and goals are different, so always do your own research or talk to a licensed financial professional before making decisions with your money. Now, let's get into it. Here's what we're covering in this video. We're going to break down a single idea that quietly separates people who build wealth from people who stay stuck no matter how much they earn. We'll define exactly what this gap is, why almost everyone gets it backwards, the two and only two levers you can actually pull to widen it, why one of those levers is far more powerful than the other, the silent force that destroys people's progress without them noticing, a real-world case study from this year that shows the strategy taken to the extreme, what the numbers say about the average person's gap right now in 2026, and finally, a simple three-step way to apply all of this starting this month. If any part of that sounds useful to you, stick around, and if you find this valuable, consider liking the video and sharing it with someone who needs to hear this. Let's begin. There is a space that decides whether you will be financially free or financially stuck for most of your life. It is not your salary. It is not the stock market. It is not even how much you manage to save in a single month. It is a gap, a literal, measurable space between two numbers, what you earn and what you spend. Some people never even look at this space. They live paycheck to paycheck, and the gap sits at zero, or worse, dips into the negative. Other people spend their entire lives trying to widen it by a few dollars here and there, clipping coupons, skipping their morning coffee, feeling guilty about every purchase without ever making real progress. But a small number of people understand something the rest of us don't. This gap, once you learn to widen it on purpose, becomes the single most powerful wealth-building tool you will ever own. Let's define it properly, because most people use the word savings and assume that's the same thing. It isn't quite. The gap is simply this: everything you earn minus everything you spend. What's left over is the gap. Financial writers also call it your surplus, your cash flow, or your savings rate, but the gap is the clearest way to picture it because it is literally the distance between two lines on a chart, one for income, one for expenses. If your expenses are higher than your income, your gap is negative. You are moving backward financially, no matter how much you earn. If your expenses equal your income, your gap is zero. You're surviving, but you're not building anything. And if your income is higher than your expenses, you have a positive gap, and that gap is the only part of your financial life that can actually be invested, grown, and compounded over time. Here's the part most people miss. Your gap isn't just a number sitting quietly in your bank account. It's fuel. It's the raw material behind every investment, every rental property, every retirement account you will ever build. Without a gap, none of it is possible, no matter how good the investment strategy is on paper. This is exactly why financial independence writers keep repeating the same idea. It is inside your gap that financial freedom is actually created. So how do you widen this space? There are only two levers in the entire world of personal finance. Just two. Lever 1, reduce what you spend. Lever 2, increase what you earn. Every budgeting app, every finance guru, every 50 ways to save money article is really just a variation of these two levers. But here's where it gets interesting, because these two levers are not equal, not even close. Lever 1, cutting expenses, has a hard floor built into it. You can cancel subscriptions, cook more at home, drive an older car, but eventually you hit rent, food, healthcare, transportation, the basic irreducible cost of simply existing. You cannot cut your way to $1 million. There is a mathematical floor to frugality, and most people hit it far sooner than they expect. Lever 2, growing income, has no such limit. There is no ceiling on how much a human being can earn over a lifetime. A promotion, a new skill, a side business, a career change. income can climb in ways that expenses simply cannot fall. This single asymmetry is one of the most underrated ideas in personal finance. That doesn't mean cutting expenses is worthless. It's often the fastest way to open up a gap when you currently have none. But if you want a gap large enough to actually change your life, the lever with no ceiling is income. There's a psychological trap hiding inside expense cutting worth pausing on because nearly every beginner falls into it. Chasing small savings gives your brain an instant reward. You stack a coupon, get a discount, and feel like a smart shopper. It's satisfying, even a little addictive. But if you zoom out and measure the actual dollar impact on your gap over a full year, it's often tiny compared to the time and mental energy spent. This isn't a reason to be careless with money. It's a reason to be honest about where your energy goes. Your mental bandwidth is limited. If you spend all of it chasing a dollar off a grocery bill, you have none left to ask for a raise, learn a new skill, or start something that could add thousands of dollars a year to your gap instead. The smarter approach is to fix the big, structural expenses once: housing, transportation, debt, and then stop obsessing over the small stuff, so your energy goes toward whatever multiplies your gap the fastest. So if income is the lever with no ceiling, how do you actually move it? It usually starts small. A new certification, a better negotiation at review time, a skill that makes you more valuable than the person next to you. None of these move the needle instantly, but they compound the same way money does. Then comes the second stage: income outside a single paycheck, a side project, freelancing, a rental unit, a small business built on evenings and weekends. This is where the gap can widen dramatically, because now you have 2 or 3 income streams growing at once while your expenses barely move at all. Here's the compounding secret almost nobody talks about. If you can grow your income while keeping your lifestyle roughly the same, every raise, bonus, or new income stream flows almost entirely into your gap. Someone earning $60,000 a year who grows their income to $100,000 a decade later without inflating their lifestyle to match can find themselves with tens of thousands of extra dollars a year available to invest simply because the expense line never moved. That is the entire secret. Not a stock pick, not a hot investment tip, just income rising while expenses hold still. But here is the villain of this entire story, and it sneaks up on almost everyone: lifestyle creep. It doesn't arrive all at once, it arrives one small upgrade at a time. A bigger apartment because you can finally afford it. A nicer car because you just got a raise. More dining out, more subscriptions, more treat-yourself purchases that each feel small and reasonable in the moment. The danger is this: lifestyle creep can completely erase the benefit of a rising income. You can double your salary over 10 years and still end up with the exact same gap you started with. Sometimes even a smaller one, simply because your spending quietly doubled right alongside it. This is why guarding the gap is just as important as growing it. It isn't only about widening the space between income and expenses. It's about defending that space once you've built it, resisting the pull to upgrade your life every single time there's more money sitting in the account. The people who actually build wealth aren't necessarily the highest earners. They're the ones who let their income rise while consciously keeping their spending anchored in place. Let's make this concrete with a real example that made headlines this year. A young investor earned just over $400,000 in a single year and spent only about $24,000 of it. To make that work, he lived in the basement of a property he was renovating, keeping his personal expenses about as low as they could go while his income climbed. That left him with a gap of roughly $379,000 in a single year. Instead of letting that sit in a bank account, he pointed it directly at real estate, turning it into rental units that now generate ongoing income of their own, on top of the salary he already earns. Financial commentators reviewing his story made an important point worth remembering. A wide income-to-expense gap is just ammunition. It doesn't automatically create wealth by itself. Where you point it is what determines whether that money compounds into more income or simply sits there quietly losing value to inflation. Not everyone can or should live in a basement to chase a gap this extreme. That's an aggressive, short-term sacrifice, not a lifestyle. But the underlying math is the same at any income level. The wider the gap, the faster wealth can be built. And where that gap gets invested is what eventually turns it into lasting freedom. It's worth adding one more real example because this pattern shows up again and again once you start looking for it. One couple tracking their own finances reported a savings rate above 75% in a single year, meaning they kept less than a quarter of their income for spending and put the rest straight into their gap. At that kind of rate, financial independence isn't a 50-year plan. It can happen in well under 2 decades, even starting from very little, purely because of how aggressively the gap was widened and protected. So where does the average person's gap actually stand right now? According to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, the national personal saving rate, essentially the average size of everyone's gap combined, sat at around 2.8% in the second quarter of 2026. For context, the long-run historical average since 1959 has been closer to 8%, and during the depths of the pandemic in 2020, that number briefly spiked above 30% as spending collapsed and government support flowed into households. Today, the average gap is a small fraction of both of those numbers. Analysts point to a familiar set of pressures behind this squeeze. Persistent inflation quietly eating into purchasing power, elevated housing costs, and rising consumer debt. At the same time, the extra savings many households built up during the pandemic have largely been spent down by now. In plain terms, for a huge number of people, the gap has nearly disappeared. This is exactly why this strategy matters more right now than it has in years. When the national average gap is sitting near historic lows, deliberately widening your own, even through modest income growth and disciplined spending, puts you dramatically ahead of where most households currently stand. It's also worth knowing that this same idea shows up later in life, in retirement planning, sometimes under the name Fill the Gap. Retirees use it to compare their expected expenses against their expected income from savings, pensions, and Social Security, then work to close or fill whatever shortfall remains using the exact same logic. Measure both sides, then work the two levers before the money runs out. The gap doesn't disappear once you stop working. It just changes shape. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding before we get to the action steps. Debt. Debt is essentially the gap working in reverse. Every dollar of interest you pay on a credit card, a car loan, or a high-interest personal loan is a dollar quietly pulled out of your gap before you even see it. That's why most financial experts agree on a rough order of operations once you find a positive gap. First, build a small emergency cushion so an unexpected bill doesn't force you back into debt. Second, pay down any high-interest debt, since eliminating a 20% interest rate is effectively a guaranteed 20% return, better than almost any investment available. Only after that does it make sense to aggressively invest the rest of your gap. It also helps to have a rough starting framework for organizing your expenses, rather than guessing. A commonly used guideline splits after-tax income into roughly 50% for needs like housing and food, 30% for wants, and 20% for savings and debt repayment. It's not a perfect formula for everyone, but it gives you a baseline to measure against so you can see immediately if your spending in any one category has quietly drifted out of line. There's also a common misconception worth clearing up before we wrap this up. People assume you need a 6-figure salary before the gap even matters. That's simply not true. A gap is a ratio, not a fixed dollar amount. Someone earning $45,000 a year who keeps a 15% gap is, mathematically, doing something far more powerful than someone earning $200,000 a year with a 0% gap, because a growing income and a stagnant income look identical on the outside. What actually separates them, years later, is entirely invisible from the outside. It's just this one ratio, quietly compounding in the background. This is also why comparing your income to someone else's is almost always the wrong measurement. Two neighbors can earn the exact same paycheck and end up in completely different financial positions a decade later, purely because one of them protected their gap and the other let it slowly close. It's worth remembering, too, that the size of your gap isn't fixed forever. Life events widen it and shrink it constantly. A new baby, a medical bill, a layoff, a marriage, a move to a cheaper city. The goal was never to keep the gap maximized every single month without exception. The goal is the long-term trend line. A gap that dips temporarily during a hard year and then recovers is completely normal. A gap that keeps shrinking, year after year, regardless of how much you earn, is the actual warning sign worth paying attention to. So, how do you actually put this into practice, starting this month? Step 1. Measure it. Most people have never actually calculated their own gap. Write down every dollar coming in and every dollar going out for one real month. You cannot widen a number you've never measured. Step 2. Attack the floor once, then stop. Fix the big structural expenses: housing, debt, transportation, one time, thoroughly. Then stop obsessing over small purchases. That energy belongs somewhere else now. Step 3. Redirect it toward income relentlessly. Every raise, every bonus, every new skill, every side stream of income, decide in advance where it's going before you feel it in your lifestyle. Automate it into savings or investments the same day it arrives, so lifestyle creep never gets the chance to claim it first. This is the entire mechanism behind almost every quiet millionaire story you've ever heard. Not a lucky stock pick, not a windfall, just a gap, defended and redirected year after year until compounding does the rest. So here is the truth hiding behind 3 simple words: mind the gap. It was never really about how much you earn. It was never really about how little you spend. It was always about the distance between the two and whether you were brave enough to widen it on purpose and disciplined enough to guard it once it grew. Your income will rise and fall. Your expenses will tempt you to grow right alongside it. But the gap, the space in between, is the one thing you control completely every single month for the rest of your life. The only question left is this: is your gap growing right now? Or is it quietly closing without you even noticing? If this video helped you see your own finances a little differently, do me a favor and hit like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more videos breaking down the ideas that actually build wealth. And one last reminder: everything in this video is for general education only, not personalized financial advice, so please consider your own situation or speak with a qualified professional before making any financial decisions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.